Hey there, welcome to Wonderful Works Talks, where we talk all about the disability ministry mission of helping churches become accessible for all. I'm your host, Barb Stanley, and today we're going to be talking about a subject that is personally close to my heart, and that is grace, judgment, and hidden disabilities. But before we get started, I want you guys to ask yourself a question. How would the world be different if we gave grace to everyone, even when we didn't know their backstory? That's right, today we're getting deep and we're going to be tackling all this with our special guest, Amy J. Brown, the co-host of the Take Heart Special Moms podcast and co-author of The Other Side of Special. So Amy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I love talking to you because you just have a heart for families who are dealing with things that other people don't always understand on the surface, that I think is so important for people to hear and understand. Can you tell us a little bit about your own personal story and why that's important to you?
Yes, I would love to. Well, I'm Amy Brown, as you say. I live in Michigan with my husband, David, and we have 6 children. The first 3 are bio kids, and then we adopted. And when we adopted our first child, she was different. And I thought, no big deal, every kid's different. But we had really troubling behavior. An example that I give is she had seizures at age 4, and the nurse said to me, "Hey, pick her up, Mom, hold her." And I didn't know how she liked to be held.
Mm-hmm.
The nurse said, "Hold her like she likes to be held." And I had this frozen moment of, she doesn't like, I don't know how she likes to be held. What's wrong with me as a mom?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize at the time that she had attachment disorder, which is a really common thing with kids that come from trauma. She also was exposed to, she has fetal alcohol syndrome and exposed to other substances. So here I have this child who looks typical, that's exhibiting really kind of disturbing behaviors. And I just assumed it was something wrong with my parenting
Mm-hmm.
because it wasn't a clear-cut diagnosis. And then we went on to adopt 2 other children. My 2 girls are adopted domestically. They're both Black, so we're transracial adoptees. Both of them have some kind of attachment disorder and mental health issues. And then our son, we adopted from an orphanage when he was 10 from Bulgaria. So he has physical disabilities, but also no parents for 10 years, pretty severe attachment also.
Wow.
So my son has a physical disability.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of rolled out the red carpet for him at school.
Yeah.
And honestly, his bigger issues at school were behavior, but they excused it because of his physical disabilities. My daughters, who looked typical, that was not the case. So it's near and dear to my heart because I felt like I felt bewildered and I didn't know what to do. I kept thinking that somehow it was my fault, like I wasn't doing things right, even though I've, for the most part, successfully parented other children. And I found myself so incredibly isolated and judged in this place. And I just felt alone. And so
Yeah.
I feel very strongly about this subject because I didn't have anyone to talk to kind of guide me or say, yeah, me too. I
Yeah.
understand this.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing your story, your 2 daughters who have hidden disabilities with the attachment, you were met with people that maybe made you feel like your parenting was less than.
Yes.
But for your son, who had the same type of behavioral issues, but was obviously had a disability because he had a physical disability, people treated you like you were a great parent. Is that right?
Right. Right. Uh,
Okay.
he would do things that needed severe discipline at school, like suspensions, and they would kind of cut him some slack.
Uh-huh.
And I think they knew that he came from an orphanage, so they had some sympathy there.
Uh-huh.
But I think there's a misconception, particularly in adopted and foster kids, that you got them when they were babies. So what's their deal? Like the idea of trauma, people don't understand trauma. It makes perfect sense that a child that had no parents and lived in an orphanage in a Cold War country, like a really
Right.
institutionalized orphanage, would have some emotional issues. That makes total sense to our brains and to my brain.
Mm-hmm.
But I had no frame of reference for the fact that a child I got as a baby could have trauma. And trauma, I just thought, oh, I'm just going to love him and do all the things I do with my other kids.
Right.
So, and I'm sure that parents that have kids that have our neurodiverse kids that are biological are in the same boat. Like, wait a minute, nothing's working,
Mhm.
and because it's not something you physically see. And I often say to moms that I mentor, like, if you had a child that had diabetes, let's say, you pretty much have a straight path of here's your treatment, here's your, not that it's not hard, I'm not diminishing that. Here's a
Yeah.
nutritionist. This is where you go to get your supplies. There's nothing like that with kids that have these invisible disabilities that exhibit with behavioral problems.
Right. So, how confusing was that to you as a mom to have these two different types of experiences for kids who all had similar type of attachment and behavioral issues?
It was very confusing. We, first of all, with my daughter Grace, that's where, she was the one that had the most severe behavioral issues.
Hmm.
So this was my first time going into advocating at church, advocating at schools. I just didn't know what I was doing.
Hmm.
And so I shrunk back a lot because a lot of the questions I would get from pastors, from church members, from teachers is, what's going on at home? Is there unrest at home? I'm going to go, yes, there is. this child's behavior. So I
Yeah.
didn't know how to advocate properly, and I kind of shrunk back. When we had our son Yvonne, it was a different story because I felt like I had a little bit more education,
Yeah.
and I could advocate a little bit more forcefully, more kindly and forcefully. and
Hmm.
and but still, I do think his story, the orphanage story, helped him
Yeah.
as opposed to the girls who came to us as babies.
Yeah. Do you see that a lot, that when there isn't that big story there, or people don't know the story, that changes the way they treat the kids?
Exactly. And what I want to say here is it's really tricky
Hmm.
because you don't want to tell the whole story. Like, let's say, for example, you had a
Yeah.
child that was sexually abused in birth home and came to you from foster care.
Hmm.
That's not something you just want to tell everybody because
Hmm.
that's their story.
Right.
And even like, I'm a little bit uncomfortable at times. I'm pretty vague when I talk about what traumas my kids have
Hmm.
publicly. I will say fetal alcohol, because that's a straight up diagnosis, right? But
Right.
that's their story. And so you don't want to tell everything to
Hmm.
respect them. So that makes it tricky. You're trying to explain things without telling everything.
Hmm.
For Yvonne, the kid in the orphanage that lies the best is the kid that doesn't get abused, doesn't get hit.
Hmm.
So I'm not saying anything disrespectfully to him to say he's a phenomenal liar. So because he was good at it, because he
Uh-huh.
had to do that, that's survival skill.
Right.
So to explain that to a teacher, like, okay, here's
Mhm.
why he's doing this, and yes, or some children when they come from orphanages have food scarcity, so they steal. Okay, we can get our minds around that.
Yeah.
Once again, we can't get our minds around the kids that come from birth, and I do think one of the things I've learned is, I just had this assumption I'm going to love him, it's going to be okay, and yeah, love goes a really long way, but
Mhm.
we need more than love to, you know, trauma and healing trauma needs more than just our human love.
Uh-huh.
There's deficits there that we can't fill. And I think that's the frustrating part as a parent too.
Yeah, that sounds like
Mhm.
it'd be quite a journey as a parent to kind of get to that place of realization. Can you tell us a little bit more what that is like for parents who are struggling with this?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just say that it's so different than how we who have healthy attachment deal with things. And
Uh-huh.
so these kids with their trauma, they have altered attachment. So I always use it like this, like in your brain, you think, I'll just love them more. I'll do more for them. But I always give this analogy, like when your gas tank is full, you just don't keep putting gas in. It's just going to pour out. And
Right.
that is how it is sometimes with these children, that my girls, you need to give them a little bit less of that. Like some kids don't want to be touched.
Hmm.
Some kids don't want a lot of emotional lovey-dovey stuff. So you have to kind of figure out what your kid needs. But it
Hmm.
is the thing that's hard as a mom specifically,
Hmm.
it is so opposite of how you would do a typically attached child
Hmm.
that you feel like you're not being a very good mom sometimes because you're a
Hmm.
little bit more not clinical, but a little bit more like just the facts ma'am kind of thing. Like we just are
Hmm.
very clear. We're not as overly affectionate because that stresses the child.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so against how you want to parent. And if the child has a altered attachment to you, they don't really like to be around you as much. They don't have attachment to you. So it's just kind of like two magnets repelling almost, like you just,
Uh-huh.
and your natural mothering tendency is to lean in. And sometimes you just have to stand and
Mm-hmm.
just trust God to show you when it's time to lean in.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does. I'm kind of thinking through it a little bit. Someone who's maybe in the beginning of this
Mhm.
and realizing that, hey, this looks different than I thought it was going to look, and the
Mhm.
things that I'm trying aren't aren't helping, and so I need to do things differently. How do you get your peace in that as a parent?
That's a really good question, and I wish I had 10 easy steps, and here
Yeah.
you go, but I don't. But here's what's worked for me. First of all,
Mhm,
it's a hard way to parent. It's very difficult. So any
mhm,
mom that's in that right now, I call it Olympic level parenting. It's really difficult parenting.
yeah.
Um, so if you're in that situation, you're listening, please know that you are doing a good job and you are
Mm,
loving well. It's just that our kids can't always accept our love. I think it took me a long time to get the shame and guilt out of how I was what was going on in my home.
yeah,
And once I got past that, because a lot of conversations and judgment towards me was I wasn't a good mom.
right. And is that coming from other people that were watching from the surface?
Yeah, at one time I was picking my kid up from some kind of thing at the Y, and I was standing off to the back, and I heard some moms talking about another mom who seems really cold and is never picks up her kid and all these things, and her kid's terrible, and that she was talking about me. And
Wow.
I was just like, first of all, I don't pick her up because I have 6. So if you have a driver, someone else is picking her. Like I
Yeah.
have, but like, and in church, sometimes I had a woman come up to me once to say, "My kids would never act this way." It's that
Wow.
kind of stuff. So yes, a lot of judgment is coming at a parent, but also the parent's judging herself. Like I judged myself. Like, what am I doing wrong? I must be a bad mom. When my
Mhm.
friends would say, "No, you're not, Amy. This is the diagnosis. This is the trauma." But it took me a long time to understand it. So I would say first, give yourself a break.
Mhm.
Um, Understand that shame and fear is lie and isolate us from people. So
Right.
we need to just say this is a diagnosis. Just like my son Yvonne can't hike. I'm not like in shame that he can't hike up a hill because of
Mm.
his physical disability. I should not be in shame that my kids act out. Now, there's a caveat there because obviously you do not want to be the person whose kid's always acting out, which was always me.
Mhm.
One time I went to a parent teacher conference and the third grade teacher said, "Every parent teacher conference has been about your daughter." So, like where do you move from there? I had to learn to toughen up a little bit
Mhm.
and just keep reminding myself, first of all, that God sees me and he's with me, but also this is a diagnosis. And so I also think knowledge helps being able to advocate when you get behind that. At first, I couldn't advocate because I was so shame filled.
Yeah.
Every call from the school, every call from the Sunday school
Yeah.
teacher, I was just like wanted to shrink in shame because these behaviors aren't acceptable. Once I kind of got, okay, this is not me. And honestly, it's not her fault either.
Right.
And let me just say one thing here is that we have a lot of questions when you're a parent of a child like this is what can they control? What is neuro? I think really that's the wrong question to ask, mainly because we spend so much time perseverating on it that we don't just move forward and say, okay, how can I best advocate in this situation? How can I
Yeah.
best support in this situation? I think that's part of it.
Yeah. I'm gonna stop for a second and talk again about the teacher who said all of the conferences are about your daughter. Um, do you feel like she thought she was going to explain the situation to you and then you're going to be able to solve it?
I
How
think so. I think,
how
yeah,
common is that?
that is very common. And one of the things I always I tell people when I'm talking to church leaders that ask me, or parents or teachers, like, we are bewildered by this behavior because it's not like I said, back to diabetes, it's pretty, blood sugar goes down, you give this much insulin. Like there's like a system to it.
Yeah.
Metal, these kinds of things, we know some triggers, we know some things they can't do, but I just as bewildered as the teacher. So in that situation, that teacher was really hard to deal with. Now, I've had teachers that we've been able to, from the beginning of the year, I will go in and go, I'm 100% behind you.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of teachers, I have a son who's a teacher, don't feel that from parents, but
Yeah.
we have to communicate. But yeah, a lot of that,
Right.
if I can give another example, like if you are in a church situation where a child is acting out in Sunday school, the last thing I think that's helpful is to call the parent in and go, what do we do? Because the parent may not know. Like a parent may know some. Like
Mm-hmm.
my kid can't have any of the snacks because gluten or sugar makes the
Right.
behavior worse. But for the most part, that's putting more pressure on a parent to figure out something that they already feel pressure to figure out.
Yeah. We always say, when you're talking to a parent, you have a child and who's struggling, you're going to work with that parent on a plan, not a solution. Because
Excellent.
a plan is inviting the parent in to work with you to try some things, knowing it might work or it might not work.
Mhm.
And so there's no pressure. But I
Mhm.
think what happens too often, I know in church, I'm sure, well, other places too, but is when a child is struggling and we just call the parent back in to say, you just see what's happening. Well, maybe if they see it, they'll fix it. How does that impact a parent who's already struggling with dealing with hidden disabilities and shame?
Well, I can tell you from the emails I get and the women I mentor, they stop going to church
Hmm.
because they already feel shame. And like I like that, like a plan, not a solution. But I want to take it a step back and say we have to listen and care
Hmm.
before we have some kind of solution or cure.
Right.
Because this is shameful when your child is behaving this way. So I know for me personally,
Hmm.
I just I circled my wagons and didn't talk to anybody about it. And that was the worst thing I could do. But
Hmm.
it's hard to talk about it
Yeah.
because people don't understand it and then they judge.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for people to say, not tell me what's going on at home, like you're the problem, but come alongside them and just listen to. When I started telling people what our life was like at home,
Hmm.
they were like, my friends were like, I had no idea. And I said, yeah, because I couldn't talk about it because I just thought I'm going to be judged.
Hmm.
So even if it's, you can't help a child behave in Sunday school because we're trying to regulate medicine and nervous systems and all those things, at least having somebody that listens and tries to have some empathy for you, and maybe you can't help that child in Sunday school, but maybe you can have a couple people that are there to talk to you or pray with you or pick up your prescriptions. I mean, I think that's the other thing that people don't understand. If you have a child in a wheelchair and have a lot of medical things, it makes sense. Oh, that mom must be overwhelmed.
Right.
Um, but you see a child behaving poorly and you think, oh, that mom isn't parenting.
Hmm.
We had a listener of our podcast who heard me speak about this, and she
Hmm.
wrote in and said she has a neighbor whose kids, she called them naughty kids, out of
Uh-huh.
control,
Uh-huh.
adopted kids. And then one day she went, wait a minute, what kind of, I think she has what Amy's talking about. I think these kids come from trauma and they have, I don't, and so this woman started going over, instead of avoiding when the neighbor was out, she went and helped her neighbor
Hmm.
with just little small things because nobody's helping these kinds of kids. So even
Right.
the smallest, an example I have is there's a lady at our church. She was one of the few people that smiled when my kids walked in and greeted
Yeah.
them.
Hmm.
And that meant the world to me because everyone else was like, oh, here come the brown kids.
Hmm.
Strap in, they're
Hmm.
here. So I don't think it takes like this big overarching, we have to solve all the problems. It's just little small, kind actions that would make a difference in such an isolating parenting situation.
Can you talk a little bit about the isolation that sometimes parents feel when they are struggling with shame from dealing with these hidden disabilities and judgment?
Yes. I think it's Brene Brown that says guilt is when you've done something wrong, shame is when you think you are that something wrong.
Hmm.
I think it's very easy in this kind of parenting to move to shame, like I'm the one wrong, because
Hmm.
we're taught, train up the child, teach them all these things, and they're going to be good. They're going to do the right thing. And our children have really sometimes disturbing behavior or acting out. So I think the shame piece where I think it's me, immediately isolates me. It immediately makes me feel like I'm the thing that's wrong. And so there's no way you're going to reach out in that situation. And then, it's hard to see, just like with a family with physical disabilities, it's hard to see everyone at the beach when your child has a wheelchair. Those kind of things are really common in our kids. Like our kids can't go to parties because who knows what they're going to do at parties. They don't have friends because they alienate friends. And all those griefs and losses and hurts, they just go deeper and deeper in us because it's a behavioral thing. And then when you do reach out, this is very common. Like you reach out to a friend and the friend's like, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And that's not what we need to hear because it just makes us think, okay, I must not have tried hard enough.
Right.
So when a parent is in that, one of the things that I always recommend is speaking truth over that shame. A practice that I have done for years is, and I always recommend it, is this is what happened. First line, like my child acted out and hit the Sunday school teacher, stole, whatever. This is the story I'm telling myself. I'm a really bad mom. I should have taught her not to do this. And this is what I know to be true. Her brain has trauma. And she can't control that impulse. And like that little small exercise, it sounds kind of like, do I have to do that on top of everything else? But that has really, and then I would add what I know to absolutely be true. Fourth point is God sees me and he's with me in this. Those 4 points, that exercise is really shaped me not to feel so much shame anymore.
I think that is so powerful. And I would definitely encourage anyone who is struggling with this to write this down, what you did, and start doing it. So let's go over it again. It was,
this is what happened.
Okay.
This is the story I'm telling myself. This is what is the truth. And that's where you would put, they have this diagnosis. And this is what I know to be absolutely true. And that is God is with me, or I'm going to live to see another day, or whatever that is. But mainly, like, the ultimate truth is that we know God's with us.
Yeah. The ultimate truth is even when you feel isolated, you're not alone.
Right. Exactly.
Yes. How important is it that you do find that community of support?
It is so important, but so difficult. My son is profoundly hard of hearing. So I went to a school for deaf children to see if he would fit there. And the principal of the school, I sat down with her, and I don't know what possessed me, but I just started blurting out about my other kids. And then I found out she had a daughter, adopted daughter that was an adult now, that had similar things to my kids. Feeling seen in that moment was so important. The problem with moms, sometimes as moms, we just don't want to talk about it. We kind of hide. So finding somebody that can just hear you, even if it's not a person that understands, is really important. And I would say, the Take Heart podcast has Carrie Holt, Sarah Klein, and me. Carrie and Sarah have kids with physical disabilities. And I just assumed they wouldn't, like, they've learned a lot from me. I've learned a lot from them. I am shocked at how much we still can relate.
Yeah.
And just because, even though our kids don't have the same diagnosis. So I guess I want to say we're made for connection, but it's easy to hide behind behavior and think, I can't risk it, because there are going to be people that disappoint us. But it's so important for us to try to reach out. And I, when I say that, I can hear eyes rolling already, like, I don't have time, or we're dealing with all these other things. But I have learned to just ask God to show me, where are the connections, where are the invitations that I can reach out to people. And if you could find somebody who has kids have similar struggles, that's great. But that's not always the case. So other moms of kids with disabilities, a trusting friend who doesn't even get it, but will be able to listen to you without offering solutions. I think that's really important. And that's why I like mentoring work, because some of these moms just need a place to say all the things without being judged. And that's what I tell moms when I mentor, like, okay, you can say whatever you want. I promise I won't judge you. And once they can start doing that, that kind of starts the process of feeling like, okay, I can maybe open up a little bit more.
I've heard that a lot from parents, that sometimes they feel like they can't be honest because a lot of what they're feeling isn't positive or fluffy.
Right.
And so How important is that to just listen without giving an opinion?
It's so important. First of all, neuroscience tells us that when we tell our story to an empathetic listener, our anxiety immediately goes down.
Mhm.
When someone has a child with behavioral disabilities and we're talking, let's say I'm talking to you and you say, "Have you tried da 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 da?" Um, my favorite is when my mother-in-law asked me, "Have I tried fish oil caplets or praying scripture?" I'm like, "Well, no." God love her. Let me just say, my mother-in-law Cece, she was wonderful, but she just didn't know. Like, it's
Yeah.
bewildering. So
Yeah.
anyway, the solutions make us feel judged. So
Yeah.
I think it's super important for a person who is trying to come alongside a family like this just to listen.
So for ministry leaders that are listening to this, what you're saying is just letting someone speak openly and listening, that is the help. I mean,
Exactly.
sometimes that's the biggest help you can give.
Hmm. Exactly.
When people try to fix things, or especially in a spiritual way, how damaging is that?
Well, let me just speak from an adoption standpoint because
Okay.
that's my expertise. One of the things that's really hard for the moms that are in this situation is the church was so excited about adoption, which we should be.
Hmm.
And they pushed it and they're like, "This is a great thing." And they brought you meals. And then when trouble comes, the church is gone. I had a mom send me a letter that said something like, "I love Jesus and I did this road, I adopted because God called me to it. I never thought I'd have to walk it alone. I thought the church would walk it with me."
Hmm.
So for leaders, it's hard to go in and like question after everyone's like had the big party and cheered you on. Why did I adopt? What was I thinking? Like people have those thoughts.
Hmm.
Um, and that sounds terrible. You feel terrible saying that. And um, so I think allowing people, families to be honest, first of all, with like I said, without a solution, and also realizing they need support. It their own spiritual support. They need someone to sit with them in suffering, and I don't think we do that well as a church.
Yeah.
I think we're quick to go, let's fix it, let's
Yeah.
have a solution. So once again, it's care before cure. It's
Yeah.
listening before solutions. Um, I remember somebody saying to me after a particularly challenging season, "I just can't wait to see what God's going to do in your family." And did this sweet little, "Yeah, I can't wait either." And then I literally went home and bawled my eyes out, thinking, "What has he done?" And I wouldn't say that to a pastor and the people in my
Right.
church because that would make me sound like a really bad Christian. But in that
Right.
moment, I thought, what has he done? This has been so hard.
Right.
And then after I kind of got on my crying out, so to the mom out there who has that big crying fit on your bed and say, "Where is God?" That's okay. I thought, well, he's with me. He sees me. He hasn't left me. It just doesn't look like I thought it would. And I
Right.
have to continue to be faithful. But if we can't even say those things to trusted people, that's just another thing we stuff down. And then we think, not only am I a bad mom, I'm a bad Christian.
Hmm.
And so I just think it's so important to have an open space for people to say what they need to say.
Do you think, Amy, just listening, that part of the issue we have is that sometimes people want to leave everything on an up note? Because I'm listening to you, and I've had some things I'm struggling with, and people say, "What a blessing you are to so and so," you know, and
Yeah.
and then the conversation's over, and then I'm like, "What?" Like that always makes me feel bad every time. And so, do you think that's part of it? As leaders, if we're trying to really be there for someone spiritually or be there emotionally, how do we end it well so that people know they're not alone, but you don't feel like it's all tied up in a neat bow when it isn't?
Well, I think that's a great question. I don't think we do that well. I think
No.
people are uncomfortable with the untidy messiness of life.
Yeah.
Um, I think if you look at scripture, and understand suffering, we are formed by that. Now, nobody wants to sign up for that, right?
Mhm.
But I am have a much deeper faith because of this life, I will say. I think for leaders and other people to give that, Romans 8:28, all things work for good, or the people that say, "Oh, your life, I don't know how you do it. I get so tired looking at what you do. You're such a Mother Teresa kind of thing." That's very isolating. And I I think if leaders and people can understand those comments, though intended well, are very isolating. They almost just negate everything you've just been kind of raw about. I think we have to be comfortable leaving the bow untied.
Yeah.
What do we know to be true? That God sees us. And I always think about that story where Hagar leaves Sarah and Abraham because Sarah's being mean to her. And
Yeah.
that's like a very quick version of what happened.
Yeah.
But she goes out into the desert and God comes to her and he says, tells her to go back. He doesn't say, oh, let's get you in a better situation. He sends her back. But she says, he is a God who, she called the place where she was, she named it a name that meant, you are a God who sees me. And that we need to be the hands and feet of Jesus to these moms and see them.
Yeah.
Not make their situation better and not like minimize it, but they need to be seen. Because when we're the hands and feet of Jesus to these people, to these moms and dads, that's going to strengthen their resolve. That's going to strengthen their faith.
Yeah. It's hard to leave things uncomfortable. I mean, I just think we all struggle with it. I think the church in particular struggles with it. But man, how refreshing is that when you're really suffering to feel like it's okay. I don't have to pretend that it's going to be all better in 5 minutes.
Right. Exactly. Because honestly, some kids do better than others, but some of these children have lifelong behavioral issues. This is a lifelong struggle for parents.
So if you are a church leader and you're in this situation where, say, you have a student who is acting out in class and you just really don't know what to do, and now you're afraid you don't know how to approach the parents, from your point of view, what would be a good next step for them?
Well, first of all, I think I would try to get some information, not in a non-threatening way. It's not the time to say, Amy Brown, your child just hit 3 people in Sunday school. Can we talk? It's another time when you say, can you tell me a little bit about your child's diagnosis? First of all, acknowledging it's a diagnosis. I had a mom tell me that her pastor said trauma is not real. Like, okay, well, let's. I know I was kind of got a little bit. I got a little bit upset about that, but like, can we talk about this in a not in the heat of the moment because you're already so embarrassed because but and then saying, tell me a little bit more about their trauma, their adoption, what it's been like for you. Because the minute they start saying, okay, she's done this, 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 and this, I'm immediately like, okay, I'm shut down right then. Tell me what it's been like for you. It starts with listening. So coming to that parent, not after the incident. I mean, I know full well when my kids have acted up. I mean, it's not like it's hidden from me or I'm ignoring it. So trying to get the backstory a little bit of what it's like in their home. And sometimes the best support you can give a family is probably not at Sunday school when their kids acting out. Sometimes the best support is other ways. I wish in a perfect world that there was a team, a few people that checked in with these parents and said, what do you need? And I admit that we don't always know what we need. But I think even if you couldn't make the perfect situation for my child, and I think that's the thing, you can't make the perfect situation for my child. But if you hear me and see me and I know that you're somebody I can reach out to, that is going to go a long way in that family staying. And I'm not unrealistic. If my kid is continually hitting people, I can't control that. The church can't control. That's okay for me to take her out, right? Like I'm not expecting them to work miracles that I can't even do. But it's the not being seen and heard that is the isolating part.
So it's working on the relationship.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So as ministry leaders, you're saying it's the genuineness of feeling cared for that is a difference maker for families. It doesn't mean it's going to solve the problem, but what does that do to the parents? That
gives them hope. And that makes them feel like they are not so isolated. I always think about church in this way. Like back in the Little House on the Prairie days, there'd be a big blizzard and there'd be like a rope between the barn to the house until you held onto the rope. The lighted up house is the church. And these parents are out here in the blizzard and they're holding onto the rope. We want them to keep holding onto that rope. We don't want them to let go and get lost and not ever come back to church and not have community. But if our light isn't shining enough for them to get back to us, I just think the church needs to be a light to these families in a way that makes them feel seen. Not solved, seen.
You had mentioned in the beginning, as a parent, when you start feeling shame, that you would stop yourself and you would automatically go through this exercise that would kind of put you in the right frame of mind. How important is it for ministry leaders or teachers when they see a situation that they don't understand to stop and change their frame of mind too?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is super important. And I don't know who said it, but somebody said, always be gracious because you never know what somebody's going through.
Yeah.
So it's our first inkling when a kid is behaving negatively to go, well, that's a naughty kid, right?
Right.
But I think if we could just stop for a minute and suspend judgment. And I get that when you see a kid acting out, it's a disturbance and you want to be done with it. But we don't do anybody, we do everybody a disservice if we don't stop long enough to go, what is going on behind this behavior? And what is going on in this family's house? Not like, where are they failing, but what are they carrying? What is this family carrying that I don't see?
How do you know if you are coming across as judgmental? What are the type of things that people sometimes do that they may not even realize?
Well, my number one rule is when you see a kid behaving, don't stop and stare and glare. Or worse, this was not a case when my kids were little, but the moms I mentor say this happens to them. Don't if you're in the grocery store, don't video it. People
Oh my
do that
goodness.
now. I mean,
Yeah.
when I heard that, I was like, what? Thank the
Yeah.
good Lord people weren't doing that when my kids were little.
Wow.
But I just watch your face because we are so sensitive to judgment because we get it all the time that you don't have to say, your kid's bad. You can just give us a look. Number one. That's number one. Number two, don't give advice. Another judgy thing is, oh, that's just a terrible twos, or that's just a teenager. No, there's more going on with my child than normal development. That diminishes me. Another thing, believe the parent, right? If a parent is telling you something, just accept it. Don't go, well, da 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 da. So those are a couple things. I will, when we share resources with you later down the week, I have a pockets episode I did is when grandma doesn't understand, I think is what it's called. So I would say probably those three things mainly. Obviously, don't straight up judge and call them naughty children or like the lady at church. My kids would never act that way. And I said, well, I'm so glad your kids don't have the trauma my kids have. Now, I would not have said that 10 years ago. I would have just slunk away. But I was kind of getting emboldened at that point and said, you know what? I'm really glad your child doesn't have trauma like mine.
Yeah, that was my next question. So if you're on the other end of that, if you're the parent, how can you respond in a way that doesn't make you shut down?
Oh, man, that's so hard because of the nature of what you're handling. But I always have to tell myself, okay, I don't understand what's happening. So how can I expect another person to? Also, not everybody needs to know the whole story. So sometimes I would say, thank you for that. There's a lot going on here, is what I would say. And sometimes I would say to people, if you'd like to know more about, trauma adoption or, fetal alcohol syndrome, I'd love to have coffee with you, but not now. Now's not the time. I'm not going to stand here in front of my child. And, it's that. And I also, it's a fine line because I've been on the receiving end of some pretty negative things. But I also want to not be so sensitive that I miss the points of connection. That somebody is trying. They just don't know what to say. I had a friend, this is a horrible, it sounds like a horrible story. Actually, I just wrote a podcast episode about this where she told me she had a dog that was really badly behaved and they had to put the dog down. And of course, when you hear that story at first blush, you're like, what the world? She's comparing my child to her naughty dog. Like, what's going on? But when I stopped and looked at it, that was a bid for connection. She was trying to make sense of my situation. And this is the only way she knew how. She wasn't judgy. She wasn't like standing over me. She just was trying. And I think those kind of connections are easy for us to miss because we're so sensitive.
Yeah.
So when I had that conversation with her, and at that point, we were talking, we had to send our daughter to a residential treatment program for a couple years because of her behavior. I happened to be on a run down by the lake. I live by Lake Michigan, ran into this friend, and she told me that story. And I was kind of mad at first,
Yeah.
But I thought about that later, like, she was trying so hard because I was so, like, upset with this decision we were trying to make, and she said something like, "There was no peace in our house," and I that little sentence went, "There's no peace in our house, Amy, you can't try any harder here. I
Hmm.
think it's time for we need some more help." And, like, that seems like a really weird way that I didn't that one didn't help me make my decision, but it
Yeah.
was a tiny stepping stone to make that hard decision.
Uh-huh.
Um, so and to people who are trying to say you're gonna say dumb things, we all
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if we're gracious about it and say, "I'm sorry, I don't know what to say," but I think that humility goes a long way.
Yeah. Yeah. That genuine connection,
Yeah.
even when it's not quite right,
Yeah.
it still counts. In some of your podcasts, I've heard you guys talk about having joy in one hand and grief in the other.
Mhm.
Can you expand a little bit about that?
Um, well, first of all, as we all know, it's super easy to constantly be focused on the negative.
Hmm.
And all of us moms with kids with disabilities, special needs, we're always on solve mode constantly, right? It's hard not to be in constant solving mode. So I kind of like to think of it like two balanced weights. We can't fill the grief bucket and not fill the gratitude bucket. Um, we have to be balanced so we can walk. If we have one of those big things over your shoulders and the buckets are, you can't walk.
Hmm.
And
Uh-huh.
so the grief is real. We have to name it. We have to lament it. We have to, but the joy is also real.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to, for me, I'm a writer, so this is easy for me to do, but like just jot down life's happening. I
Hmm.
think we tend to say, okay, I'm thankful for my house and my family and da da. But I like to write down, this is what I want to remember
Hmm.
because life is so daunting sometimes, especially when you have kids with invisible disabilities. Recently, my child, one of my children has severe mental health issues. She had a situation that she was struggling, and I was so upset that she was struggling that I missed. Her therapist goes, "Good for you. You reached out. You did this thing." And I missed them all because I was so focused on her struggling again. So I
Hmm.
think it's important to take those small moment living is what I call it, where you write down small things that happen. This is what I want to remember. Today, my child hugged me, or which normally doesn't happen, or I got to have ice cream with this other kid who I always feel like's left out
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
he's, a sibling. And when I would go back and read my journals, I would think to myself, "Oh, life was happening the whole time, and wonderful things were happening." I think that helps us balance those scales a little bit. And you can do that by taking pictures. There was one year I took a picture every day on my phone of something that just made me smile. It could just been the sun or the snow or the whatever. I think it doesn't have to be this big dramatic anything. I just think it needs to be small.
Hmm.
And that kind of balances out that grief.
Hmm. That's really important. Can you tell us a little bit about your own faith journey?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I will say that when I started this journey as an adoptive mom,
Hmm.
I was like, oh, I just, I remember that verse, God has plans for you, as in Jeremiah, not to harm you or fail you, whatever. And I'm like, okay,
Uh-huh.
my life's all good. And then we had some issues with adoption. Um, I would say that my faith journey has been one, we talk about Psalm 23, how the good shepherd, it's not about the journey. He's in us in the valleys, he's in us in the mountaintops, he's beside the still water. It's about the companion.
Hmm.
And that took me a while to figure out because in my brain, back to we wanted in a tidy bow. I wanted to adopt these kids and love them and feed them and dress them all in matching outfits and have great pictures. And then it was all going to be okay. But I had to realize that, okay, what I expected, this is not what I expected. This is nothing like I expected. But that
Yeah.
doesn't mean there's not beauty and God in it.
Right.
So I had to start um, turning my gaze to my companion, which is Christ walking with me,
Hmm.
not the destination. Like if I could just get past this one hard thing, I'll be up on the mountaintop and then everything will be okay. But that thing never happened. We never got there. So
Hmm.
really for me, learning to abide in Christ, learning to sit in silence, learning to practice gratitude, see the beauty in life,
Hmm.
know that he sees me in the worst moments, in the hardest moments. Know that I can say whatever I want and he loves me and he made us. And he walks with us has been almost like a process instead of a result, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
this is a relationship. It's not an end result where everybody,
Mhm.
gets it together. This is
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're kind of going back to what we want in our personal relationships too.
Mhm,
Not having to have everything neat and tidy and tied
mhm,
up, but
mhm.
just still there in the uncomfortable open where
Right,
you can be your most authentic self.
right,
I think that is so key to all of this because, I mean, truly, Christ is the model for
right,
each one of us. But man alive, I mean, just going back to the beginning of this conversation, that's what we want. So if
right,
we are trying to support families who are going through this, really what can we learn from our relationship with Christ that we can give to other people?
right. And also, nobody likes to be in the messy middle. We like things concluded. And
Right.
one thing that has been really helpful to me in the last couple of years is when Jesus says to, I think it's the blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?"
Yeah.
Now, I could name, I don't want my kids to be this. I want you to heal their brains. But really, Lord, I feel like every day I have open hands. I don't
Hmm.
do this perfectly. I clench my hands a lot when things
Yeah.
get out of, but like if I can open my hands and hear God say, Jesus say to me, "What do you want me to do for you, Amy?" And it took me a long time to even say anything
Hmm.
because I'm so used to like dealing with everything. But once I could go, I just want to have peace today. And it may
Yeah.
not look like quiet house with no tantrums, but
Right.
I want to have inner peace. And once I started like looking for that kind of not a solution, once again, not a solution, but
Mhm.
just kind of a listening heart and God is listening to me and asking for things like that, I
Yeah.
felt like that was enough grace to get me through each day. Now, I didn't do that perfectly, let me tell you.
Yeah.
There've been
Yeah.
lots of times I've been really mad at God. When it was our
Yeah.
3rd daughter started having issues, I thought, "Really? 3?
Yeah.
Really? Like,
Hmm.
can you cut me a break here?" But it's little. It's I think we look for the big movie ending, but it's the little small graces and joys that help us walk this journey.
Amen. Do you have any encouragement you want to leave for parents who may be in a similar situation?
I would love to tell anybody listening who's in this situation that, first of all, I totally understand you're not alone. I understand where you're coming from. I know how isolating and lonely it is. But I just want you to know you're not alone and that you, regardless of how your child behaves, you're loving well and you're doing good work. And find somebody to reach out to and talk to.
Mhm. Can you tell us a little bit about your resources, Amy, because they are so helpful for families and for churches?
Well, we have, first of all, Carrie, Sarah, and I have the book, The Other Side of Special,
Hmm.
um, that I think is helpful for anybody, whether you're a caregiver or not, because we've had people say, "I didn't have any idea this is how you guys felt." So it's a great resource. We have our podcast, Take Heart Special Moms, which you hear us talk about all kinds of
Hmm.
options and issues, and you hear my take. If
Hmm.
and you hear Carrie's take and Sarah's take, we have great interviews, we have great conversations. Um, if you want a more one-on-one, you can find me at amyjbrown.com. I do mentor. I love that's my absolute favorite work to do. And that just looks like me coming alongside you and hearing your story and helping you be well resourced. And I can help you with things like how to advocate an IEP. But my real heart work is teaching moms how to be well resourced so they can walk this journey.
Yeah.
So you can find me at amyjbrown.com for that kind of information and blog posts and everything. But yeah, that's where you can find us.
Well, that is terrific. We are so grateful for you talking to us today and cannot wait to share your resources with everybody because I can't say this enough. The work you do to support families is so important. Thank you for being a change maker.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That is very kind of you to say. And thank you for having me. I've loved this conversation.
Thank you.
To learn more from Amy, visit her at amyjbrown.com, check out her podcast, the Take Heart Special Moms Podcast, and buy her book, The Other Side of Special, available on Amazon. And don't forget, if you like this podcast, please like, subscribe, and share with others. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.